Hi, this is David at TED-IELTS, and today I want to talk to you about the first sentence of your IELTS essays. It is often said that first impressions are everything, and whilst that may be a little bit of an exaggeration, they certainly are important. So let's talk about what you should and should not do in the first sentence of your IELTS essays. As always, this video will be divided into chapters. The first 6 will be things you need to avoid, and the next 2 will tell you what a good first sentence looks like. I highly recommend that you watch the whole video, but if you want to skip around, you can use the chapters that are down below. Right, let's begin the lesson. First of all, we have an annoying phrase that I actually wrote about on the TED-IELTS Facebook page a few days ago. I post mini lessons there every day that cover vocabulary, grammar, and IELTS advice. In this case, the phrase was "in today's modern society." This is one of those annoying things that I call IELTS phrases. This is because they seem to exist only in the IELTS exam. When you hang around with IELTS examiners, they constantly complain about these irritating and weird expressions that just don't exist in normal English. In fact, beyond being overused in IELTS, this phrase is completely redundant. If you Google it, the first result is titled "Common Mistakes," so there's a big clue for you. Why would we say that something is both today and modern? Also, we seldom use "in today's society," so even if you modify it, it's still a rubbish phrase to use. Instead, try one of these. If you go to a training school or watch IELTS videos online, and the teacher says you should use this phrase to start your essay, then please do not use that phrase. I promise you that your teacher is an idiot and does not understand either English or IELTS. There are no magic phrases that can give you an amazing score, and when people become popular by promising this, it actually backfires for their students. In China, where I used to work, the most popular training schools taught students to write "with the development of" at the start of every essay. Now what happens then? IELTS examiners read this hundreds of times and feel, well, like this. Even in those rare cases where the phrase is used correctly, it is clear to the examiner that it is not your language. You've just copied a template and you will be penalized accordingly. Instead, when it comes to writing an introduction, write a sentence that is appropriate for that essay. Don't just write what you've been told to write. Many IELTS teachers tell their students to paraphrase the question in their first sentence. However, this can pose some problems. Whilst it is possible to paraphrase the question well, many people get it wrong. The problem is simple. They look at the question and automatically begin writing a sentence that aims to repeat it, but with different words. I would say that in 90% of cases, this leads to one of the following problems: incorrect word choice or incorrect grammar. The first problem is that they frequently choose incorrect synonyms. This is because in English we have many words that are near synonyms, but few that are direct synonyms. It is very hard for a learner to know these differences, so often they make big mistakes that can impact the meaning of the whole sentence. The second problem is that paraphrasing often leads to grammatical problems. Now, this can happen for several reasons, but primarily it occurs because people try to change the form of the sentence slightly so that they aren't just copying the question. However, grammar is hard. When we try to paraphrase, we often forget the basic rules of grammar and make silly errors. But what if you picked the right synonyms and avoided any catastrophic grammatical errors? Is paraphrasing still a good idea? Not necessarily. It is usually obvious to the examiner that you're just copying the question with minimal effort to disguise it. And there's one more paraphrasing problem, but this one deserves its own chapter. Right, here's a big problem that I see people make, and this one tends to affect those who otherwise would be capable of getting a band 7 or 7.5. It is agreeing or disagreeing with yourself. Now let me explain. The problem begins with paraphrasing the question. Let's say you're given this question. Many people would simply paraphrase it by saying something like, nowadays people often buy products because of how they are advertised rather than the fact that they need them. So what's wrong with this sentence? Nothing. Grammatically, at least, it is fine. The problem is that the candidate has simply copied the idea from the sentence, but they're going to agree or disagree with it in the next sentence. This is a catastrophic error. The problem is that you have stated something as though it is your opinion. As such, whether you agree or disagree with it, you're agreeing or disagreeing with yourself. Can you imagine saying, I like football. I agree that I like football. Or worse, pizza is delicious. I disagree because pizza is not delicious. You'd sound a bit crazy, right? But this is exactly what thousands of IELTS students do because they're not thinking. They blindly paraphrase and then follow some preconceived template by agreeing or disagreeing. It is a big problem and it needs to stop. As I will explain later, it is a good idea to start your essay with a general statement, but you can also be a little too general. By this, I mean either stating something that is so broad in scope that it does not really relate to the specific topic and requires many sentences to focus in on the precise issue, or it is just a meaningless statement. For example, let's say there's a question about pollution. A candidate might want to begin by talking generally about the Earth as a place that humans need to protect. This is quite reasonable, but be careful. If you wrote something like this, for example, it would not work. It is so general and so obvious that there is really no need to say it. Similarly, if you were talking about protecting the seas, you should not begin with really obvious statements like fish live in the oceans or water is wet. These things are just not necessary, not relevant, and not worth saying. You need to make sure that your first sentence guides your reader logically towards the main idea. But we'll come back to that later. Finally, let's look at something I call overstatement. By this, I mean saying something in such a way that it is not really true. For example, it might involve using words like always or everyone. These are in fact seldom true because few things in this world apply to everyone. Indeed, in the IELTS marking rubric, it specifically says that you would not score higher than band 7 for task response if you use this kind of language. Common problems here include starting the essay with statements such as everyone knows that, or as we all know. Now this sort of error tends to vary from culture to culture. In East Asia, it is very common because that's how people think and speak in those languages. Even if they know that not 100% of people believe something, they will say it because it's close enough. However, in IELTS we have to be specific, and so we should avoid saying everyone when it's not really everyone. Whilst that mistake primarily occurs in places like China, in countries like India and its neighbours, it is very common that people begin their essays with the idea of controversy. They say things like, there is a controversy surrounding a certain issue, but is there always one? No. In fact, oftentimes it is a quite minor issue that you simply have to discuss. It would thus be untrue to say that there's a controversy. Even in situations where you are not totally wrong and words like always and controversial are possible, I would still refer you back to mistake number 2 because these phrases tend to be cliches. The people who write them are typically just using memorized phrases, and this is not really a good idea. We've now seen 6 things that you need to avoid when writing a first sentence for your IELTS essay. So it's time to explore how we should do it. Writing a good first sentence requires reading the question carefully so that you understand the main issue. My advice here is to read it several times, plan out your essay, and then turn the question paper over when you begin writing the introduction. This may seem strange, but it is actually quite important because it can stop you from copying the question or paraphrasing it too closely. It requires you to actually use your own language and ideas and to logically connect your sentences. Remember that a first sentence that is too closely paraphrased will likely contain various mistakes and will not logically connect to the next sentences, so this can really help. But what sort of sentence should you write? Whilst I earlier suggested not being too general, it is a good idea to start with a fairly general sentence. Let's say that the topic was whether to teach art or science in school. You might begin by saying, for as long as there have been education systems, there has been discussion over what to include in school curricula. Your next sentence would then say something like, while some favor the arts, it is increasingly common that people look for more scientific subjects to be included. From there, of course, you say, this essay will, and then you begin your discussion or argument. We've started with a broad statement, refined it to the specific point, and then told the reader exactly what our position is and what the essay will do. It is an extremely logical and effective way of writing an introduction. By the way, I wrote a long guide to writing Task 2 introductions, which I'll link to in the description below. Before we end this session, I thought it might be useful to share a few examples so that you can see what I mean by avoiding errors and following a few pointers to produce good first sentences. Firstly, let's look at this question, which asks us to agree or disagree with the idea of banning regular cars and replacing them with electric ones. I would begin by tracking the history of the petrol-powered car from its invention to the present day. This would allow me to, in the next sentence, state the problem with this and then put forth the argument that we should end their use and switch to electric vehicles. Here's another question. Before we begin talking about recycling, I want to talk about the broader issue of pollution. So I will start with a big statement that mentions environmental catastrophe, and in the next sentence I would bring up recycling. It guides the reader logically while showing the examiner that I can use my own words and ideas rather than simply copy and adapt the question. Here's an example of a first sentence that is nearly too general, but works because it focuses the reader's attention on the broad issue, which is with an allusion to future troubles, allowing me to be much more specific in the next sentence. My next sentence would explain this notion, tying it to the present situation at a worldwide level, before I give the essay outline. And finally, here's a question on a totally different topic. I would start my essay by referring to the background of the problem, and then focus in on one specific issue, which is that, thanks to loans and credit cards, people are getting into debt. Now, as you can see, this sentence is different from the previous three because it does bring up the main issue within it, rather than simply acting as a broad statement to be developed in the next sentence. Remember that there is no perfect single formula that you need to follow. A great first sentence could be written in 100 different ways, and you need to find ones that work for you. First impressions are important, and even though IELTS examiners are professionals who will read your whole essay and give you a fair grade for it, they will be subconsciously affected by what they read in the first sentence. As such, make sure that this sentence sets the tone for your essay by presenting an intelligent introduction, guiding your reader naturally into the main idea. It is usually best to start with a broad issue, then focus on something more specific, but do avoid being too general. If you follow the advice I've given you today, you will have a good chance of writing an effective first sentence, and that will set you up to produce an essay that can get you a high band score in your next IELTS test.